All right, we're going to kick the show off now. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm going to turn on my video just a second. There we go. Thanks for coming today. The topic of today's talk is about surveying during the lockdown. This is about a household survey that's being run in India, the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. So I'm going to start right off the bat. What is the agenda for today? One, what is CPHS, the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey? Two, what can I tell you about the design of the survey? Three, what can I tell you about its execution? Four, how did things change in the lockdown? And finally, five, what are some early results from the most recent wave of the survey that was conducted between May and August of this year? Okay, so what is CPHS? Consumer Pyramids Household Survey is India's largest household survey during the lockdown. To our knowledge, the next largest household survey did 2/3 the number of respondents that we did during the lockdown in only 15 of the states in India, and on a sample that was somewhat different from the sample that we have. We are also India's largest regular household survey, lockdown or not. Our sample frame currently includes more households across the country than the last round of the NSSO surveys, many of which which many of you might be familiar with. Finally, as far as we know, we are also the world's largest household panel survey. The next largest household panel survey is less than half the size of ours. But let me be a little more concrete. What is CPHS? CPHS is an all-India household survey of a panel of sample households designed to capture fast frequency measures of well-being. What do I mean by that? First, let me tell you what I mean geographically. On an all-India basis, we are in 28 states and union territories. We survey over 3,900 villages across the country and over 320 towns. What do I mean by a panel of sample households? We survey over 174,000 households across the country, which totals to a little over 1.19 million individuals. And we have been running this survey now successfully for 20 waves. We are on the 21st wave. Each wave lasts for 4 months, so there are 3 waves in a year. What do I mean by fast frequency measures of well-being? As I just said, we do 3 waves in every year. We've been running the survey now for 7 years. We started on the 1st of January in 2014, and we capture over 600 indicators on the households and their members. Sorry, I forgot to mention at the very beginning of the talk, if you have questions, please ask your questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to answer as many of them as we can as soon as the slide deck is done. When I say 28 states and union territories, what do I mean? Here's a map of India to help you understand. It's easier for me to start off by describing to you where our survey does not operate. For example, CPHS does not cover the far northeast. We don't cover the states of Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Mizoram, and Manipur. We do not cover the far north. The region of Ladakh is not accessible throughout the year. CPHS does not cover some union territories. For example, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, Dadra, Nagar Haveli, Daman and Diu, and the Lakshadweep Islands. Finally, we do not cover some parts of India due to extremist actions. So in the state of Chhattisgarh, we have pulled out of one district, Dantewada district, and in Jharkhand, we have pulled out of a couple of villages in a couple of districts. And this was due to the safety and law and order issues in those areas. Other than that, we cover the rest of India. So CPHS covers every other part of India. So in terms of its geographic breadth, we cover as much as we possibly can, and we are continuing to make strides in improving our coverage, especially in the far northeast. Now, what do I mean by 600 plus indicators? I'll take you through them kind of pillar by pillar. The most important pillar is a pillar called the People of India. It's the first part of our data set. It includes questions on identity, which includes information on caste, on gender, on marital status, on caste category. So there are hundreds and hundreds of castes in India, and it's easier for researchers to have them binned into categories that are more useful economically and legally. Relationship to the head of the household, of course, religion, age, migration status, and state of origin. We also capture information on education. We ask questions about literacy, about the discipline of study, and educational qualifications to all members of all households. We ask many questions about their financial inclusion status. We ask members whether they have life insurance, whether they have a bank account, a Kisan credit card, a regular credit card, an EPF account, which is a provident fund account, health insurance, whether they have a mobile phone, and whether they have a DMAT account, which is an electronic account that's used for certain kinds of transactions on the stock markets. We ask many questions on employment. We ask about your employment status. Are you employed? Are you not employed, actively looking for work? Are you not employed, not actively looking for work, etc.? Conditional on being employed, we ask questions about the industry of your employment. We ask questions about your occupation. We also ask questions about your employment arrangement. Are you full-time work? I'm sorry, employment arrangement is, are you a salaried worker, or are you a casual worker, or a daily wage worker, etc.? We ask questions about whether your work is full-time or part-time. We ask you questions about where you work physically. For example, do you work in a laboratory? Do you work in a warehouse? Do you work in a farm? We ask questions about the nature of your occupation. For those people that are not employed, we ask them about when they think they will start working, their time to start working. And when there are changes in their employment status, we also ask them when that employment status changed. We ask questions on health. We ask every member whether they're on regular medication and whether they're healthy or if they're hospitalized on a self-reported basis. We ask many questions on time use. This is interesting. I don't know too many other surveys that do this in India. In particular, we ask questions about the time spent in a given day on indoor entertainment, on hanging out, on work, on travel, on religious activities, on outdoor sports, and learning. Work is incredibly critical, and I want to focus on work a little bit more, since many of the people that are attending this webinar mentioned that they have an interest in labor economics. We don't just ask questions about the time spent on work. We actually ask questions on work broken down by work as an unpaid volunteer, work as an unpaid trainee, work for your employer, as well as work from home. This is, as I said, just the first module of CPHS, which we call People of India. There are 3 other modules. I'll take you through each of them one by one, but not in complete detail. We ask questions on assets at the household level. For example, we ask questions on whether the household has a TV, a house, a fridge, an air conditioner, a cooler, a washing machine, a car, a computer, whether they have cattle, whether they have a generator to create electric power for the household, whether they have a tractor or a two-wheeler. And we don't just ask whether they own these assets. We also ask whether they have bought these assets in the previous 120 days, or if they intend to buy these assets in the coming 120 days. For cars and two-wheelers, we also ask about the type of car and the type of two-wheeler that they have. We ask questions about savings. In particular, we ask whether the household has any savings in any of these instruments. That's savings in businesses, in real estate, in listed shares, in gold, in chit funds, which are a peculiarly Indian savings instrument that some of you may be familiar with, in Kisan Vikas Patra, which again is an Indian savings instrument, in mutual funds, in fixed deposits, in the Provident Fund, in post office savings instruments, in life insurance, in the National Savings Certificate, etc. Here again, we don't just ask about whether households have saved in these instruments. We also ask questions about forward-looking behavior of these households, about whether they will save in any of these instruments. Then we ask questions about borrowing. We ask both about the source as well as the purpose of borrowing. We ask, for example, whether you have an outstanding borrowing from a microfinance institution, from a money lender, from a self-help group, from a chit fund, from your employer, using a credit card, from a shop, from a non-banking financial corporation, from a bank, or from a relative. We also ask questions about why you have a borrowing. So for every outstanding borrowing, we ask whether the borrowing is for the purpose of investment, or to finance a vehicle, or for debt repayment, or for business, or for consumption expenditure, or for durable purchase, or for medical reasons, housing, education, whether it's a marriage loan or other reasons. Not only do we ask about sources and purposes, we also ask for every source, what is the corresponding purpose? Then we ask questions about household amenities. In particular, we ask about every household, whether the kind of roof the household has, the kind of walls the household has, the household's access to water and electricity. And this is measured not just as a yes or no question, but the number of hours in a given day that the household has access to water and electricity, and the number of days in a given week that the household has access to water and electricity. We also ask about whether the household has a toilet on site. And interestingly, we ask a kind of catch-all question about civic amenities. We ask the household how much time it takes for them to travel a distance of 10 kilometers. And this is a rough proxy for various different civic amenities that the household has. All right. All of these variables are in the second pillar of Consumer Pyramids Household Survey, which is called Aspirational India. There are two more pillars. One of them focuses on consumption. The other focuses on income. So let me take you through income first. We ask questions on monthly member income. And what do we ask in particular? We don't just ask how many rupees did you make in the last month. In fact, we ask how many rupees did you make in the last month, in 2 months ago, 3 months ago, and 4 months ago. This is because even though we meet the household only 3 times a year, it's critical for a lot of research to have a completely filled in monthly time series of income and consumption. And not only do we ask about their total income, we break it up as income coming in from wages, income from interest, income from dividends, as well as income from pensions. It's not uncommon for many households in India to also have income at the household level. So along with monthly member income, we also ask questions about monthly household income. In particular, we ask for the total member income, which is just summed up from all the member incomes we collect. But we also ask specifically about household income at a monthly level that is received through lotteries and gambling, through rent, through government transfers, through private transfers, through the sale of assets, as well as business profits. All of this forms the third module of the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey, which is called Income Pyramids. Finally, our fourth module is on consumption. We ask the household, and here we don't ask members, we ask households, but we ask the household about monthly household consumption. And we ask this for a large variety of consumption categories. There are so many of them that I can't put them up on this slide. We ask for over 153 consumption categories. Here are a couple of high-level categories. So we ask about monthly household consumption, consumption expenditure on EMIs, which is the repayment of certain kinds of loans, consumption expenditure on health, on communications and information, on the purchase of appliances, on going out to restaurants, on the purchase of intoxicants, on the purchase of power and fuel, on recreation, on clothing and footwear, on transport, on cosmetics and toiletries, on food, on education, as well as bills and rent. Now, many of you might ask, and rightly so, how is it that we can expect households to remember consumption on over 153 categories month by month, up to 4 months into the past? And for this reason, we also ask weekly household consumption for a shorter set of categories, for only 27 categories. And we use these weekly consumption snapshots to produce adjusted consumption figures at the monthly level. And we make both of these available to researchers. So researchers have access to the raw, exactly as they were reported, amounts of consumption of households at a monthly level, as well as the adjusted figures that are adjusted by CMIE on the basis of the weekly household consumption data that we capture. We also release the weekly household data consumption if that's something that's of interest to researchers. So this is the final module in the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey, which is called Consumption Pyramids. And so CPHS consists of these 600 plus indicators across these 4 modules. Now, at this point, you might rightly ask me, what do you really capture in a question like, is healthy? And I can give you the short answer now. It's a self-reported question and it's a binary question. So we just ask, are you healthy, yes or no? And if you wanted to know more on this, one thing that we encourage all of you to do, we encourage our subscribers to do, is to go to our website. Our website is on the bottom of this slide. It's consumerpyramidsdx.cmi.com. Once you go there, you can click on how we do it on the top left-hand side, which will take you to all the documentation on the survey. And this documentation answers exactly these kinds of questions. So for every indicator, you can find out exactly what we capture. You can look at some sample distributions from the previous wave. And there's a lot of other data and details there. And I encourage all of you to go check it out. If you're not a subscriber to the service, don't worry. All the documentation is freely available. All you have to do is just create a free username and password, which should just take you a matter of seconds. Once you've done that, you have access to sample data and all of the documentation. And through that, the answer to many of the questions that you likely have. You might also ask me, what's the reference period for time use questions? And the reference period, just in case you were wondering, is we ask respondents to think over the last week. And if you're not able to find that answer in the documentation, as a subscriber, another way that's open to you in terms of understanding what's happening with the data and moving forward in your research is that we allow all subscribers to ask clarifications through the website. We have a team that answers these clarifications around the clock, and we try as much as possible to give researchers very, very quick turnarounds on questions about what indicators mean, about the usage of weights, on anything to do with the survey, really. And that's another way in which you can ask questions. Our aim really is to add as much value to the research or production function as we can. One way to do that is to be very transparent through documentation, which is what we aim to do through the documentation on the website. The other way to do that is to be available to answer questions about the survey whenever someone has a question. And we do that through the Seek clarification system. And that's, again, something that's really great. And that's available to all of you who are already subscribed to the dataset. You might also ask questions like, I'm interested in crime, but your survey doesn't seem to cover it. What can you do for me? In which case, my answer is, well, we can't do too much on the website, but we do run partnered surveys, and this is something that we do almost every single wave of the survey. So if after having gone through all of our documentation and all of the indicators that we capture, you say to yourself, you know, I really wish that CMI asked these 10, 20, 30, 600 additional questions. Please write to me. My email address is now on the bottom of the slide. It's kkrishnan@cmi.com. We're always eager to run partnerships, and that's something that we're happy to talk about. There's not a lot of detail on the website because that's a more one-to-one arrangement, but please do write to us if that's something that's interesting to you. Okay, that's it about the indicators for now. I think this gives all of you a reasonably good, 30,000 feet up in the air feeling about what this survey is all about. I'm going to jump now into talking to you a little bit about the survey design. So how do we run this massive all India survey where we capture 600 plus indicators on households and members? In particular, what is the sample frame for this? The first thing that I want to talk to you about is, or maybe the easiest way to explain this to you is to consider one of the states in which we operate. If this map is not familiar to you, this is the map of the state of Karnataka, and the boundaries that you see are district boundaries. So all states in India are broken up into districts. And what we do is that we bin districts together, districts that share boundaries and have similar agroclimatic conditions, similar levels of female literacy, and similar levels of urbanicity. And we club those districts together and we call them homogeneous regions, these super district entities. And this is the super district mapping of Karnataka. For each of those homogeneous regions, we have a rural strata which consists of all of the villages in those homogeneous regions. The list of villages we get from the census. The most recent census was the 2011 census. We also have an urban strata which consists of all the towns in that homogeneous region. We stratify the towns further into very large towns, medium towns, and small towns based on the number of households that they have. Now that we've done this, we select villages through simple random sampling for the survey. And we select at least one very large, one medium, and one small town through simple random sampling, again, for each homogeneous region, if possible. So some homogeneous regions might not have a very large town, in which case the set of very large towns for their homogeneous region is 0. That's how we select our primary sampling units. Primary sampling units are villages and towns. Eventually, we select households inside these villages and towns. How do we do that? Households are our ultimate sampling units, or USUs, as you can see on the slide. For sample villages, we simply select 16 households through systematic random sampling. For sample towns, We break the towns up further into wards, and wards are further broken up into census enumeration blocks. And of those blocks, we select at least 21 blocks through simple random sampling. The number is at least 21. It increases depending on the kind of town that you are. And for each of those blocks, we then select 16 households again within that block through systematic random sampling. And we repeat this process homogeneous region by homogeneous region, state by state across India. This is what gets us to the number that I showed you earlier, which is an all India coverage of 3,965 villages and 322 towns. And this corresponds to 63,430 rural households and 110,975 urban households. Now, here again, you might pause me and you might have questions, right? So you might, for example, say, is the district of Bharuch in Gujarat in your sample? To which my immediate answer is yes. And again, I would encourage you to go to the website, consumerpyramidsdx.cmi.com, and click on how we do it. And you'll find that there are a bunch of PDFs that describe in detail how we actually do the survey, the sample design, and the survey design. And questions like the one that you might have on your mind are easily answered in this documentation. You might also ask, how many villages and towns do you have in Bihar? Because there's an upcoming election in Bihar, and Bihar is something that I'm really interested in studying. And so again, I can answer to you on the spot and tell you that we have 16 towns in Bihar and about 175 villages. But if you want to know this for every state, that's in our documentation, and I would encourage all of you to go take a look at it. You might also ask us, how many districts do you cover in Kerala? How do I know that you're covering all of the districts that are important or the ones that I care about? Again, this is in the documentation. In Kerala, for example, we cover 14 out of the 14 districts. It's not always the case for every state. We cover most, though not necessarily all districts, because our sampling is at the level of these homogeneous regions or these super districts. Again, the details are in the documentation that you can access quite readily. You might also simply want to know how many households we have in a state. So in the state of Rajasthan, for example, we have we have 9,700 households. So almost 10,000 households in just one state, which is the state of Rajasthan. And if you're interested in those statistics, again, all of that is answered for you in the documentation. You may also have questions about dynamics from wave to wave. So for example, you might want to know what's the average survival rate of a household in the panel, given that it's a panel survey, from one wave to the next. And so on average, from one wave to the next, going from wave 1 all the way to wave 20, the wave to wave survival rate for us is about 87%. Again, our documentation has excruciating details about what these sample panel rates are like, what the survival rates are like, and what the attrition rates are like. So, you might say, tell me your deepest, darkest secrets. All of our deepest and darkest secrets are in the documentation. I encourage all of you to go check it out. The reason I'm talking about this is to really emphasize, I think for us, one of the things that's critical is to make sure that we are as transparent as we can be in the way in which we conduct the survey. That's a big reason why we put the documentation up there. It's available for anyone. You don't have to be a subscriber. You just need a user ID and password, which is free. Please look through it. If you are a subscriber, it's all the more important that you convince yourselves that the data, the sample frame, the way in which the survey is executed work, and that you can trust the data. And please go ahead, look through the documentation. If you have any questions after reading all of the documentation, even if you don't read all of the documentation and you have some questions, please feel free to email us. If you're a subscriber, please feel free to ask clarifications through the system, and we'll get back to you as quickly as we can. All right. Now that I've told you a little bit about the survey design, I can't tell you everything about it in this talk. I'm going to quickly move to start telling you a little bit about the way in which we execute the survey. This is not how we execute the survey during the lockdown. This is how we executed the survey during peacetime. The first thing, the most important thing that I want to say about the way in which we execute the survey is that the survey execution is continuous and it's even through each month of the year. And in a country like India, this is incredibly important to get right, especially because there are, when there's large numbers of households that are engaged in agriculture, and agriculture is a very cyclical phenomenon, you want to make sure that you're not surveying households in a given state or a given region in only one of the 4 months of the survey execution. So in any wave, and a wave lasts 4 months, we predetermine the number of households across each month, and that's spread out geographically across the country. So in each of the months of the survey, you can see that we survey approximately about 43,000 households. And in fact, it's not just that it's continuous and even through the months, it's continuous and even every week of the survey, because we really want to ensure that week by week, we're covering India in a way that's representative so that we can use and consume those statistics into something that's useful for research. Okay, and so here again on the slide, you can see that week by week, we have a fairly constant rate of household execution during the, of survey execution during the wave. The next thing I want to tell you is, how can we pull this off, right? How can we do 28 states, 174,000 households, 600 indicators, even execution week by week, month by month? How does this work? Again, there's not a lot of secret sauce here. There's really two things. The first is we have a completely in-house team. We don't outsource any of the surveying to anybody else. We do this ourselves. This is almost 300 people who are employed full-time by us just in the household survey group. And the other important point is from the very beginning, from the 1st of January 2014, the entire survey is done electronically. There is zero paper anywhere in the survey execution or in the operations. So all the way from an enumerator on the field somewhere in some state in India, collecting answers to questions, to you as a researcher getting that data, it's entirely electronic, the entire system. And so we're able to build a lot of quality control into that system. Let me tell you a little bit more about this. So of these 300 employees that work on the survey, 200 of them are the field team. These are people who are going into the field and actually conducting the survey. The remaining 100 perform purely supervisory roles. And this is critically important to make sure that the quality of the survey is good. The lowest level of supervision is performed by these people called FIOs. FIOs are field information officers. They are the first level of supervision. There are 77 of them, and they do real-time checks on the data as the data is coming in from the field. On top of the FIOs, there are survey managers and deputy survey managers, the SMs and the DSMs. The SMs and the DSMs are responsible to ensure that the survey is running smoothly in the regions that they manage. There are a central planning team based out of Mumbai of 2 people, and there are 2 data guidance managers who perform an ancillary kind of quality control function. And these 100 odd supervisors complement the 200 people in the field who are collecting this data. And as I also said, there's zero paper in the survey, and that allows us to do a lot in terms of technology in making sure that the quality of the survey is relatively high. All of the data is collected on handheld Android GPS-enabled phones. The GPS logs are used to ensure that enumerators are physically at the locations where they have to be to conduct the survey. And this is not the physical location of the village, it's the physical location of the household. We have that level of precision to ensure that the data has been collected at the right place. As soon as the data is collected, as soon as the survey is completed, and as soon as the phone has some data signal, the data is immediately uploaded into CMI servers. And there's a variety of checks that take place. The GPS is matched, as I said, to make sure that the data was collected where the data should have been collected. The data is checked for internal consistency. So for example, if you say that you were unemployed, it shouldn't be the case that you had wage income, right? The data is checked against prior data for the household. So if the household was chugging along at a steady state where it was earning 10,000 rupees a month, and all of a sudden the household reported that they were earning 20 million rupees a month, that gets flagged immediately. And the supervisors, the FIOs that I described to you earlier, will call the field team in the field in real time and say, this doesn't look right. Can you go back, can you check, or can you explain to me why this is the case? We also check incoming household data against neighborhood data, right? So we know that it's, while we want the beauty of outliers to exist, if all of a sudden we see that there's a particular household that's doing something that's kind of out of sync compared to the other households in the region, we immediately make sure that the supervisory team goes in and checks and makes sure that everything is okay. So as I said, supervisors check all of this in real time. There is zero post hoc cleaning of the data. So there is nobody anywhere in the food chain at CMIE who has the admin rights to go in and go to a particular cell of the data and say, well, that shouldn't be 3, that should be 3.2. That's just not how it works. The final point, this is again very critical in ensuring that enumerators work effectively and that incentives are aligned, is that all payments are made electronically and they're made directly to the staff member. So there's no scope for an enumerator doing something that a manager wants them to do because they want to get sure that they're paid on time. So all payments are electronic and go directly to the staff member that receives the payment. Okay, here again, right? You might have hundreds of questions to ask me. For example, you might say, where are these 5 survey managers located? And I can tell you those locations, or you can go and read the documentation. Or you can ask, who can make changes to the weekly plan? The answer is survey managers can make changes to the weekly plan. All of this is again recorded in the documentation. You could ask, can an FIO edit an enumerator entry? The answer is no. They can only make remarks, but they can't actually edit those entries. These are some more kind of serious questions. You might ask, okay, if this is a 0-paper survey, where can I find a questionnaire? And this is a little peculiar, right? Not everybody is used to a completely electronic survey, so there isn't a physical questionnaire. That being said, there is a document on our documentation website called the questionnaire, and I encourage all of you to read it because it will explain to you how we do the questionnaire. And if you're really confused and you don't like this whole app business where we have apps that we use to collect the data, etc., the good news is every single data capture screen of that app is available on our website, and you can look at them and convince yourselves that the app does what the indicator says it's collecting. Okay. I'm going to move on now from CPHS execution. Now that you know what the survey is, now that you know the way the survey is designed and how it's executed during peacetime, I'm going to tell you about how that changed during the lockdown. To do this, I need to tell you a little bit about how the survey was going before the lockdown. The most important thing that I want to tell all of you is that CPHS never stops. Okay, the survey does not stop for weekends. The survey does not stop for public holidays. In certain locations, there might be occasional disruptions due to natural calamities. In certain locations, there might be occasional disruptions due to internet shutdowns, law and order issues, things like that. But otherwise, the survey never stops. There's one exception to this, and that was the 22nd of March, 2020. That was the day when there was an all India lockdown, the first one in India since the COVID-19 pandemic broke out in India, and it was popularly called the Janta Curfew. The 22nd of March, 2020 was the first and only time in 2,464 days of survey operations that we stopped in-field operations. Everything did not stop. There was still validations happening. There were still acceptances going into the survey, but there were no new responses being collected in the field. That was the first and the only time that that happened. But let me give you a little more color so that you can understand exactly how things were going. So the 22nd is this important and critical date that you need to keep in your minds, the so-called Janta Curfew. And the metric that I want to talk to you about is this metric called daily acceptances. We could use many other metrics to look at how the survey was performing. This is a good metric. What is daily acceptances? It's just the total number of validated and accepted household responses that go into our database. Okay. And so before the curfew, we were chugging along at somewhere above 1,000 households being accepted every day. Just before the curfew, that number had dropped a little bit to about 932. On the day of the curfew, of course, we didn't conduct any interviews in the field. And we were hoping that on the 23rd, we go back to business. We start running the survey again. We tried to resume operations, but we faced a lot of resistance in the field. One, states had started imposing their own lockdowns, even though that one-day curfew was lifted. Two, the curfew had really changed the way respondents thought about COVID. And there was a lot of fear in opening your door and allowing a household survey to be conducted. And so the next day, which is on the 24th of March, the Prime Minister of India announced that there would be a nationwide lockdown from the 25th of March. And so you can imagine what happened. Our daily acceptances tanked. So by the 23rd of March, we were down to just 186 acceptances. By the 24th of March, we were down to just 14. And we had to ask ourselves a very serious question on the 24th, which is, what do we do? Knowing that there's going to be a nationwide lockdown that's being imposed. We had two options. One option was we wait for the lockdown to end. We don't do any surveying during the lockdown, then we resume survey operations once the lockdown is lifted. The other option is we switch from face-to-face surveys to doing telephonic surveys. And keep in mind that we've never done telephonic surveys before. So now what are the pros and cons of waiting until the lockdown ends? Well, we know how to do face-to-face surveys well. And in contrast, we don't even know how we would conduct a telephonic survey. Doing a face-to-face survey and simply delaying it means that we don't have to change our existing systems and processes. Even if we knew how to do a phone survey, setting up our systems to be able to do it would be a huge overhaul. And at the time, on the 24th of March, it was only a 21-day lockdown that was announced. And we thought 21 days, we might be able to catch up. On the other hand, the cons were that a 21-day lockdown meant that we only had 15 days left before the wave ended. And as a rule, we're not allowed to spill over beyond the wave. And so the wave was from January until the end of April. And that would mean that we only had 15 days to catch up on the 21 days that we had lost. And during the 21-day lockdown, we realized we can't even hire additional staff to speed up execution after the fact. Most importantly, we didn't know, would the lockdown go on for longer? And so given this uncertainty, the cons really outweighed the pros, and we chose to do the telephonic survey. We chose that option one was not a viable option. So let's go back to that graph that I was showing you earlier and think about where we were on the 24th of March. We were at 14 acceptances. The lockdown had just been announced, starting the very next day on the 25th for 21 days. All of these decisions, this decision to switch to a telephonic interview, that was done in one day. So by the 25th, we decided, all right, we have to switch to a telephonic interview. And now the question was, how do we make sure that we can run a telephonic survey, right? And there's many moving parts to this. How are we going to do survey execution? Who would make the phone calls? We can't do GPS checks on the phone. It's much harder to conduct phone surveys compared to face-to-face surveys. It's more likely for a respondent to reject a phone call than it is to reject someone at your doorstep. And the decision we took was that we would make the 79 field supervisors do the interviews rather than the 200 field interviewers, because we felt that the supervisors were better trained and they were more reliable. And so we could rely on them to get the survey done rather than the field interviewers. This also meant that we had to do less training. And so this was one thing that helped, right? So even before the lockdown was announced, we'd already spent some time on training, and we didn't need to spend a lot of additional time to start the telephonic survey. And we thought, okay, at least on these 79 supervisors, we think we can get them to start making calls by maybe the 27th of March. Okay. Next, the question was, do we use the same survey instrument as before? We only have 79 people running interviews instead of the usual 200. So should we field a truncated instrument and keep response rates high? Or should we keep the existing instrument and accept a lower response rate? Again, this was a dilemma, and we chose the second option, which is to keep the existing instrument, because even a drastic reduction in the instrument size wouldn't help us cover the full sample. And there's such a huge fixed cost to getting a household to respond that it's better for us, conditional on getting a response, to do the entire survey with them. And the basic roster information is critical. You know, that plus income plus expenses, that can't be truncated, that has to be collected. And so we didn't design a new instrument. And using the same instrument again meant that in principle, we didn't have to do any additional work after we took the decision to switch to a telephonic survey. Now, who would do planning and supervision? If the 77 people that were doing the supervision would now do the surveys, who would supervise them? And the obvious answer is that we have roughly 17 people on top of them who do more region-wise planning. Those people will now be looped in to also do the daily supervision that the regular supervisors would do. And so the 17 survey managers and deputy survey managers were roped in to start doing supervision as well, right? And on top of that, they had to continue to do the planning. And so it's no longer possible to do our regular planning because the lockdown and the pandemic changes everything, and the phone survey changes everything. Households might take much longer to respond, et cetera, et cetera. Households might talk to you at odd hours on a phone survey, and we're capacity constrained. So all of this, and of course, we had to maintain state level balance as well as rural urban balance. So all of this meant we had to do far more pragmatic planning. And finally, how would we do validation now? We had to relax the GPS checks because we can't do GPS checks on phone calls. We had to relax the reliance on historical data because the way in which households respond to the pandemic and the lockdown is very different from how households have been responding historically. And so we didn't rely on that historical data as much in the validation. So validation rules were relaxed, and there was a lot more hands-on checking that was required, which our survey managers would do. Okay, so even if we get planning and supervision out of the way, the next big question, the question that many of you are probably thinking about, is where are we going to get the phone numbers from to do the survey? And this is where the fact that this is a panel survey that we've been running since 2014 comes very much in handy. We had to do face-to-face surveys for 7 years. And doing those face-to-face surveys involved storing phone numbers because we had to fix appointments to do those surveys. And we would sometimes have to do callbacks for QA purposes. And we conducted the survey every 4 months, which meant that we regularly updated phone numbers for the members in our household survey. And the fact that we repeatedly went to the same household again and again and again meant that we had a fairly good relationship with these households. As a consequence, many of these households entrusted us with real phone numbers and not bogus or fake phone numbers. So finally, we had phone numbers for 92% of the sample. And that was great because that meant that we had already the phone numbers that we needed to start a telephonic survey before the 25th of March. Now, all of this is great, but we needed to make huge back-end changes in our technology to actually be able to conduct a survey over phone. We needed a new survey app. We also needed a new validation app. This is the app that's used by the managers. Here again, a lot of the work had been done by us already, and we had the foresight to move our tech team into work from home well before the lockdown was announced. So the IT team had already transitioned home, which meant that they could start work on a new survey app as well as a new validation app. On top of that, since we had the same instrument as before, that meant that we had to do less work in editing those apps. Since we had ready phone numbers, those could also feed in to both the survey app and the validation app. And so we were able to develop those fairly quickly. In fact, we were able to redevelop those apps within just a day, which meant that we had one more day to do testing and validation to make sure that the system actually worked. And once that was done, we were able to hand over the survey app and the validation app to a set of trained supervisors who would now conduct the survey, and a set of highly trained super supervisors who would continue to perform a supervisory role and make sure that planning and validation was done well. And so everything was done within a 2-day period. We made the decision on the 25th. And by the 27th, we were ready to go and we were back in the field, which meant that CPHS was back online within just 2 days. But now it was a telephonic survey. With all of this now as background, I want to take you back to that graph and take you back to the 24th of March. But I'm going to expand the time horizon so that you can see how our decisions played out over time. Okay, we made the decision to switch, or rather to switch to a telephonic survey and resume the survey, like I said, on the 25th, and we resumed by the 27th. As soon as we started, our acceptance started to pick up. So by the 29th of March, we were at 182 acceptances. By the 5th of April, we were at 432 acceptances. We expected, since this was a 21-day lockdown, that the lockdown would be lifted on the 14th of April. If that were to happen, we were expecting that we would go back to face-to-face operations and we would be back at over 1,000 acceptances per day. As we know now, that lockdown was never lifted. In fact, it was extended to the 3rd of May, which meant that instead of us going back to the pre-lockdown level of 1,000 plus, we continued around that 432 mark, and we averaged about 425 in the month of April. So what happened was that we cut down the number of interviewers from 200 down to 77. So a roughly 1/3 reduction in the number of interviewers led to a roughly 1/3 reduction in the number of acceptances. So it's fairly linear in terms of the number of interviewers we actually have running surveys. As I said to you, the wave started in January, ended on the 31st of April. So the transition was on the 1st of May. And we ended up finishing wave 19 with a response rate of 64.4%. That's much lower than in prior waves. We were averaging 84% and above, but still, despite the conditions of the lockdown and the difficulty of conducting a survey in the lockdown, we missed only 1 day in the field, and we had a fairly high acceptance rate of 64.4%. Now, this continued to play out because from the 1st of May, we knew that we were still in a lockdown, and it was likely to be the case that this lockdown would extend further. So the wave 20 was from the 1st of May until the 31st of August. And we had to conduct that entire survey, that entire wave almost within the lockdown. So now you're seeing an even more expanded time horizon going up to the 1st of October. And the first thing that I want to tell you is, as again, we all know now, lockdowns were extended again. And so we continued to average slightly less than before at about 400 acceptances per day. That was the May average. And we realized, okay, we have to somehow get back into field operations. And that means we have to start planning early for these face-to-face interviews. We needed to find interviewers. We need to start retraining those interviewers. We need to plan simultaneous face-to-face and telephonic interviews, because some parts of India would allow face-to-face interviews where the lockdown had been relaxed, but other parts of India would still require us to do telephonic interviews. And this was a huge logistical challenge. And so that work started early, and we were able to start field operations finally in mid-June. And we started face-to-face operations in some parts of India, limited parts of India, and telephonic operations everywhere else. And so in the first half of June, we still averaged about the same as before, about 414. But you can see immediately, once we started face-to-face execution, our acceptances started to inch up. We inched up to 648 acceptances in the second half of June. We got into July, and that started to rise. We got to 750 acceptances by the first half of July. That number fell slightly to 702 in the second half, because that's when the second set of re-lockdowns started to happen across the country. And there was, again, a huge logistical nightmare for us to be able to deal with the fact that areas that had opened up were starting to close down again, but we were able to figure out how to do it. And by the end of August, we were at over 950 acceptances through a mix of face-to-face and telephonic interviews across the country. We weren't yet at the 1,000 plus that we were doing pre-COVID, but we were very, very, very close. We were in shooting distance of that number. And so we ended the wave fairly strong. And that wave ended on the 31st of August. Wave 21 began on the 1st of September. And right now, we're still doing strong. We're holding at that rate of acceptances as daily acceptances. And as many of you know, there are still restrictions in many parts of India, and we are trying to push as much as we can to resume field operations wherever it's safe and possible for us to do so. Let me summarize what happened in Wave 20. Wave 20, because it was conducted almost entirely in the lockdown, almost entirely telephonically, we did see a lower response rate. We only got 43.8% as a response rate in Wave 20 compared to 64.4% in Wave 19 and 84% plus in the waves before that. Despite that, that's still the largest survey to have been conducted during the lockdown. We surveyed over 76,000 households across the country and over 380,000 individuals. And so we are by far and away the largest regular survey to have happened during the lockdown. Now that you've kind of broadly understood, at least in a very vague, not vague, fairly precise, but high-level storytelling sense what happened during the lockdown, if you're curious on learning more, there's a note again at our website, consumerpyramidsdx.cmi.com. When you go to the How We Do It section, which is just about how we ran the survey in the lockdown, I encourage all of you to read it. But I can tell you a little bit more about things that happened in the lockdown. The first set of things I want to tell you about is I want to show you some statistics from this wave, wave 20, which is between May and August, which is entirely during the lockdown. And the first set of statistics I want to show you are purely distributional. They're not about actual questions and answers to those questions. Because I'm sure many of you are thinking, okay, it's great that you have a 43% acceptance rate, and you've got 76,000 households across the country and 380,000 individuals, but is this still as representative as the household survey was before the lockdown? And so here's the first graph that I want to show you. This is the distribution of households across various states pre-lockdown. That's from the 1st of January to the 23rd of March. And I'm going to show you now in the lockdown shock, that's the immediate period following the lockdown. So from the 23rd of March, not until the end of the wave, that's the 31st of August, but I want to zone in on just a 2-week period immediately after the lockdown until the 7th of April. And so as you can see, the color that you're seeing here is the pre-lockdown distributions of households across states.
This is the immediate lockdown shock distribution. So you can see that they're fairly close. And there's a couple of things that seem a little odd. In particular, if you look at Delhi and Haryana, you see that the Delhi rate has suddenly increased drastically in the lockdown shock period, and the Haryana rate has come down drastically in the lockdown shock period. That's because Delhi and Haryana are very close to each other. And what was happening is that the teams that were covering Haryana started to converge on Delhi. Things like this were happening in various states. And so we took corrective actions in that first week, 2-week period. I'm going to show you the next graph, which is the same thing, but now looking at this over a longer time horizon, which is all the way through until the 31st of July. So here again, you can compare the pre-lockdown levels of the number of households, rather the distribution of households across states compared to the post-lockdown levels. There are still differences. There are some notable differences. I'm going to take you through them. States like Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu are largely urban, largely industrial states, and they did see their share fall during the lockdown. So Maharashtra went from 11.7% to 10.7%, 1 percentage point drop. And Tamil Nadu went from 5.7% to 4.8%, also a 1 percentage point drop. 1 percentage point in lockdown conditions, I think that's pretty good. There are other states that also exhibit some divergences. States like Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh are largely agrarian states, and they saw their share correspondingly rise. And so, oops, sorry about that. They saw their share correspondingly rise. Here again, Bihar went up from 5.6% to 6.5%. Similar percentage point increases for Madhya Pradesh, for Rajasthan, and for UP. Basically about a percentage point, maybe a little bit over a percentage point in the case of Uttar Pradesh, increase or difference between the pre and the post-lockdown time periods. Then there are a couple of, I would say, like the next tier of industrial states. So for example, Gujarat, Karnataka, West Bengal, they saw a total decline in their share. They all went from 5.2% pre-lockdown to between 3.2 and 4.4 percentage points. 4.4%. So again, roughly a 1 percentage point decrease. But by and large, as you can see, there are not huge swings in the state distribution of the households that we visited, that we surveyed post-lockdown compared to pre-lockdown. Oh, you can also see that we rectified these kinds of, more nitty-gritty operational issues where Delhi was doing much more than before and Haryana was doing less. Those kinds of issues were also fixed. Okay, and I want to show you something else, which is also kind of very important and critical as far as our survey is concerned. Really, there's two things that our survey really needs to get right. One is the state level distribution. The second is the urban-rural coverage. I want you for a second to just focus on the number before the 1st of April. It's hovering at about 34%, and that's by design. By design, we oversample urban households, urban areas, because we think there's a lot more interesting variation that's happening there. And this oversampling can be corrected for with the sampling weights that we provide you. And so we do roughly 2 urban households for every rural household. And as you can see, that number spiked around the 29th of March. And this is critical because at that time, we also find a huge shock to unemployment. Unemployment rate went up from 7.5% to 23.8%. We wanted to make sure that that increase was not driven by the fact that we were suddenly oversampling urban relative to rural. And this made us very aware of this fact that we had to preserve the urban-rural distribution. And so you can see now clearly what happened. We immediately took corrective steps and we made efforts to preserve the urban-rural balance. And so pre-lockdown, our urban-rural rate was 33.6%. Post-lockdown, there was that shock where we went up to 43%. So we were doing far more urban households compared to rural households. Excuse me, it's the other way around. Sorry, we're doing far more rural households than urban households. And then that fell back in line and we got back to very close to a third rural, 2/3 urban in the post-lockdown period. Of course, there's a little more variation in the in the lockdown period, because there are the difficulties of conducting a survey during the lockdown. So you can see there are certain peaks which are much higher than that 33, 35% band. Despite that, On average, we did, I think, a very commendable job in noticing that the urban-rural split had changed and immediately taking corrective action to maintain that urban-rural split. What does all of that mean, right? So we managed to maintain urban-rural split. We managed to maintain state-wise distribution, pre and post. Does that mean that we got roughly the same covariate distribution during the lockdown as we had pre-lockdown? Here, there's one way for me to show it to you. You can do many cuts of the data. I'm just going to show you one or two. You can see annual household income in thousands of rupees for households pre-lockdown. This is the during lockdown period. And as you can see, we've done a very good job of trying to maintain that income distribution. The largest change within a bin is a 2 percentage point, 2.13 percentage point change. And so why am I showing you all of this? Why am I showing you distributional changes of covariates? Why am I showing you that we maintain state level balance, urban rural balance? It's not really to pat ourselves on the back. Rather, it's to make the point to researchers like you that the data from May to August are reliable and they're representative of Indian households, and they should be used to study what's happening or what did happen during the lockdown, and they're as reliable and as representative as the data that we were collecting before the lockdown. Okay, now that I've shown all of you everything about the survey and I've shown you that distributionally we were able to maintain state-wise balance, rural-urban balance, and covariate balance across many key demographics, and hopefully at this point you're interested and excited to kind of look at the data and explore things. I want to motivate a couple of interesting use cases for researchers to explore. The use case here is a purely labor economics use case, and that's mostly driven by the fact that when we surveyed all of you as you signed up for the survey, most of you seemed interested in labor economics. I can also see that I only have a minute left, and so it's good that I'm only doing one example. The example I want to show you is an example that I discussed earlier, which is that we saw this huge spike in the unemployment rate, but we also saw that settled down by May and came back to pre-lockdown levels. And this is perplexing to many people. And does this mean really that we're seeing a full recovery, right? So the unemployment rate rose sharply in March and April, but then dropped to pre-COVID levels. So are things back to normal? And can we use the survey to look at that? One of the things we could do is we can look at annual household income. And this is annual household income until April 2020. You can see in April, it had come down to 12,500 rupees compared to where it was trending both 6 months ago and a year ago at much closer to 21,000 rupees. And so there's a 6-month drop of 9,800 rupees, or a 44% drop in average household income in April compared to October. And compared to a year ago, if you're worried about seasonality with agricultural income and things like that, it's still a 40% drop. And that's a fairly sizable drop. And all of this is possible to do with the record level data that's available to researchers. You could ask, what's going on? What's driving this? How is this happening? Here's one way in which you could try to explore why it is that incomes are collapsing. I'm showing you here some of the time use data. In particular, this is the time spent on work. And as you can see in wave 18, people that were employed mostly worked 8 hours or more. This is what was happening in wave 19. Wave 18, by the way, is a pre-lockdown wave that's September to December of 2019. Wave 19 is January to April, and wave 20 is May to August. And you can see that the number of people working 8 hours and more dropped in May to August, according to their time use data, compared to pre-lockdown. And so people working 8 hours or more fell from 80% of employed people to just 55%. So there's a huge cutback on the intensive margin. You can also see that there's a corresponding increase in the number of people that reported working less than 8 hours. People went from just 20% working less than 8 hours, conditional employment, to 35%. And a huge increase in people reporting as employed, but actually working 0 hours. In fact, going from almost 0 to 8% of people reporting themselves as employed and actually working 0 hours. And you're starting to see already how the data are rich enough to take this stylized fact that unemployment rate fell and try to say, but really, what is going on? Can we get something much more concrete about what's happening to the labor force? So I showed you one example using time use. you can potentially do a lot more. You can break down employment characteristics by full-time, part-time. You can break it down by employment arrangement. So are you a salaried worker? Is there a huge movement from salaried into casual work, for example? Are people working in different industries now? You can use the panel nature of the data to look at the same set of people who are employed now. Maybe they were working in different occupations before. There's many ways to try and answer the question what the future looks like. You could also, for example, look at some of the more aggregate numbers that we ask questions for. So we ask households, how are your family finances today compared to a year ago? And here again, you can see a huge drop in the number of households that report that they're better off. So it used to be that a third of all households would report that their family finances are better now compared to a year ago. It's now gone down to 4%. So less than 1 in 20 households now report that they're better off. In contrast, the number of households reporting that they're worse off has shot up. So from it being stable at about 1 in every 10 households saying that they're worse off now compared to before, that has gone up to 1 in every 2 households reporting that they're worse off in May to August compared to in the waves before. Again, this is not the only thing that you can do with the data. The data also can help you answer questions because there are indicators that ask exactly this. How will the family be faring a year from today? The forward-looking question. What do you think about financial and business conditions 12 months into the future, 5 years into the future? Is this a good time to buy consumer durables? Tell us about your borrowings by source, by purpose. Will you save by different kinds of household savings instruments over the next 120 days? Will you buy assets over the next 120 days? All of this data is already there in the data set, and all of it is very useful in putting together a more complete picture of what's happening to households and what's happening to the economy during this period. So, I just want to throw a couple more ideas out there and then I'm done, and we'll open up for Q&A. You could do other things, for example, the things that I've not done in this graph. You could adjust for inflation. You could adjust for household size. You can break down income. This is really important, right? So for example, if we think, or if we're interested in understanding the degree to which welfare programs, government transfers were able to help households during this period, the degree to which social networks, private remittances were able to help households during this period, you can do that. You can break down income by wage income, by business profit income, by private transfer income, by government transfer income. And again, we have a very rich set of covariates, right? So it's not just that you can do this in the aggregate, you can do this and see, is it that rural agrarian communities have a better safety net in terms of private remittances compared to other communities, right? You can slice and dice the data in many ways. I've not done any of these, and I would encourage all of you to do them. You can break this down by state to see very different patterns that are happening across states. You can break this down by rural, urban. You can break this down by household demographics like education groups, income groups, occupation groups. So not only do we provide the actual education levels and income levels, we also provide a bunch of groups so that it's easier for researchers to use the household data. There's a bunch of pre-created bins if you want to just bin the data and see what's happening. And all of this is stuff that one can potentially do with the data. For example, look through the monthly consumption data. There's 153 categories. I've not looked through any of them yet, and I'm sure that they're fascinating. I think what's happening on the financial inclusion side would be particularly interesting, as would be, for example, questions on health, a lot of the questions on time use. All of this data is there, it's available. The wave ended on the 31st of August. We pushed the data out to subscribers on the 1st of September. The next month of income and consumption data will be finished again the 30th of September this month. And we're aiming to push remember the income and consumption data are monthly. So they have a different cadence of release. And we're aiming for that monthly data to be out as quickly as we can. In October. Oh, I forgot to mention, of course, you should be looking at amenities because the COVID response is not the only thing that's interesting. For example, you might be very interested in studying, I think it was last year, the Prime Minister announced that there would be a huge scheme to ensure that water reached every household. We ask questions on whether households receive water, right? So it's not necessary that research questions should be limited only to what's happening during COVID. I think that's what's exciting. That's what a lot of people are interested right now. There's a lot more that's in the data set, and I encourage all of you to look through it, look through our documentation. Like I said, it's all public. Please write to us. If you're already subscribing, please look through the data. I think there's a lot more to be done. Just to make a point, all of the results that you just saw me present are from the public files that are available to researchers. I have no privileged access to the data. I got the data on the 1st of September, like every other researcher, and I put these graphs together. It's very easy for the data to be used. There are weights. It's relatively easy to consume the data. And again, I encourage all of you to go do it. That's really it. So please explore. Go to our website. Again, it's consumerpyramidsdx.cmi.com. My name, in case you don't know, is Kaushik Krishnan, and that's my email address below, kkrishnan@cmi.com. I've also included the email addresses of two of my colleagues, Sadhana Shah and Gaurav Kapoor, and those are their email addresses below. Please feel free to reach out to us, regardless of whether you're interested in using the data or if you just have questions about things that exist in the data. Like I said, really, our aim in the household survey group is to make the data as accessible, as usable by researchers as we can. We just want to be seen as the capital A, the mysterious thing in the production function that makes everybody more efficient, right? So we're not only interested in providing you the data, we're also interested in making sure that you have the documentation, that questions are answered as quickly as possible, and that you can use the data and get going quickly. So please start talking to us if you aren't already. We're very, very excited for researchers to start using the data, despite the fact that the survey started in 2014. The data was released to subscribers. The record level data was made available to researchers only in 2017. And we're really, really keen to build a research community around this. We're happy for any suggestions that any of you have on how we can do this. So please, again, do reach out to us. I see there's a bunch of questions already in the Q&A. So I am going to now move into answering some of those questions. If you haven't asked a question and if you feel like you've got everything that you wanted out of this, that's great. If you'd like to stick around and have your questions answered, I'm going to try to answer as many of these questions as I can. I'm sorry, I went a little over time. I finished 10 minutes late, and there's a lot of questions. I see 21 questions. So please just give me 1 minute. I'm going to look through the questions really quickly. I'm going to turn off my video, if that's okay. And I'm going to keep this slide up in case any of you need to see our email addresses. And I'm going to start looking through questions one by one. Okay.